you mentioned the sort of long duration aspect of collaboration, which I thought would be a great point to start with, because you have this extraordinary group movement called Moved by the Motion, and it involves many different practitioners besides you. It involves the poet and writer Fred Moten, but it involves also many artists, Josh Johnson, of course, there's Asma Maroof, I think Patrick Belaga also, Total Freedom. It's a long list. Can you tell me a little bit more about the beginnings of Moved by the Motion, how it became this long duration collaboration, and also about your hope, which I thought was so beautiful, what you told me last time, your hope that it actually should last forever for the rest of your life.
That is a long duration. Hopefully. I hope that's a long duration. Yeah, where do you want to take on this? I mean, I think like, so Moved by the Motion began, I think almost 8 years ago now. And it was initially an experiment to help Wu and I in our first collaboration. And as we started to get to know each other, she had a lot of questions about my practice, I think, so that she could understand how to approach it with her medium at the time, which was like, the project was like a video. And I had a difficult time, I think, in the beginning, articulating my practice through words. And so I said, okay, I can answer your questions, but I need to maybe dance instead of speak. And that experiment turned into a small performance, and that performance was called Moved by the Motion. And it's interesting that actually to say this out loud, to recount it, because I think that is at the core. It's like experimentation and play is at the core of our band or of our collaboration. And it's something that we wanted to continue. It couldn't stop at one performance or one event. It needed to be something that went outside of us or something. If that makes sense.
And also just beyond the two of us.
And beyond the two of us, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, it definitely started as an exploration of like performance in relation to like the camera, or like the language of filmmaking, the language of performance, and also just movement and words and how those things impact each other as performers.
Great, and can you tell me a little bit more about the different members? Because I think it's fascinating how interdisciplinary it is. I mean, I once read Diaghilev at the very beginning, when I started to curate, I was very inspired by Diaghilev. Diaghilev talks about this idea of bringing all the disciplines, together in a way through ballet, sort of through the ballet russe. In a way, Diaghilev pooled dance, literature, fashion, music, composing, choreography. All of that came somehow together, and it seems in a similar way in your case that you bring in these different disciplines. And I was curious about that, and maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the different, members and also participants. And also, I'm interested in how it kind of connects to that idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it started with Patrick Belaga, who's a cellist. Patrick comes from a classical training background, but he primarily is an improvisational musician. And I think that was like one of the initial connections with him. And shortly after with Josh Johnson, who's also a classically trained dancer, but whose medium is improvisation. And so I think like the initial connections in our collaboration started really building off of what we started with, which is this idea of like improvisation being the root of what we're doing and using language and movement and sound to kind of like respond to each other. So Moved by the Motion literally came from like oh, if you do this, I'm going to say that. And if I say this, then you're going to do that. And it kind of like, we never know where it's going, we know where it starts, but we never know where it's going to end. And then that just kept growing, I think, Fred also, I was doing performances and films with him as well. And like, I think always from the beginning, it was always very like integrated with the stuff I was doing with Tosh. And I think Fred, he's a writer and a poet, but he also is very much an improvisational thinker and writer, in the sense that I think his writing practice also comes from sort of a performative one and a spoken one. And I think he thinks a lot about improvisation. So it's just been like a really fun dialogue to be able to have that with him and Asma. I started doing parties with Asma in LA like 2010 or something, so a really long time ago. And I think like we all have done different things, and she has her DJ practice, and she does all kinds of collaborations with musicians and film scoring and things. And we feel really lucky to have her with us in Zurich as well, because that's really like expanded into electronic music. And actually, since you said fashion, I'm realizing fashion actually does play a role, in the sense that I think we always collaborate with designers when we do costumes for performances. And, it's one of those things that's not necessarily given like visibility in the front, except for the garment, but the people who create those things are also band members, in the sense, like, as well as the cinematographer and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think discipline is to cross disciplines is it made me think about, I had the word discipline, and also just specific medias or practices that are, and I think also expectations of like mastery in art, of sticking to one form. And I think that it's like, well, we're currently working on Moby Dick. So this like metaphor is like always just in my mind, but like what it takes to turn a ship, it requires a crew. And to cross disciplines feels like when I collaborate with someone, it's like, it feels like the best way to communicate something is through multiple angles or perspectives. When it comes, so if my practice is performative, or I think art in general is always through it, the desire is always to connect or to reach someone else. And so to do that with multiple disciplines or multiple mediums, it's like everyone's experience is so different than another person. So like if I can say something through movement, or Wu can say something through verbal language, it also like to have it played through the cello is like, if in case there's something that somebody misses, it's like it's there on all sides. It's like you can really be wrapped on all fronts, visually, sonically, in presence, through language, through light, through darkness, through dance. There's no constraint in that sense.
Beautiful. And that brings us right away actually to Zurich, because you mentioned Moby Dick. And before we talk about Moby Dick more in detail, I want to ask you more generally about your involvement with the Schauspielhaus and with Zurich, because it's very connected actually to the theme of longue durée, and go sort of beyond an evental kind of structure, because it's a very unusual situation, I think, in terms of performance and in terms of art in general. I think that an artist has several years, in a way, as a collaborative situation or constellation, we could maybe call it, with an institution. Very often, it's a show. One prepares the show lasts a few months, or it's a performance which lasts a few, evenings. But here it's really a multi-year project, and it's you, and it's moved by motion in Zurich. It also actually meant that you moved to Zurich. Can you talk a little bit about this very unique experiment?
Yeah, it's very unique and an experiment.
And we love it.
And we love it. And
I love it here.
Yeah. I think we owe this opportunity to the artistic team at the Schauspielhaus, because they really approached and sort of persistently engaged in conversations with us about bringing us here, and really like upfront, the offer was like that they wanted to make a long-term commitment to our project. Like minimum 3 years was kind of like the starting point. And I think coincidentally, Tosh and I had also been really wanting to manifest something like this, where we could, because we felt so defined by the travel, like our work felt so constrained to, it wasn't like it was limited, but it was like it had to be produced in a certain kind of way to like satisfy the demands of like the constant movement, like the touring, the biennials, just like always needing to be in a new city. And so we were just simultaneously really wanting to just see what would happen if we could stay in one place, how the work would change. And also, especially with our collaborators, like how it would mature and evolve if we had that kind of commitment with each other to like literally show up every day to a rehearsal space and work. And that's what we've been able to do here so far, which is incredible.
Yeah, I think before we came, we had really, both individually in our separate practices, but it's also as our collaboration, been yearning for a different kind of time frame. I think it was really, really stop and go, go. And actually MPAC in Rensselaer, upstate New York, invited us to do projects over the last years. And at the time we got 2 weeks together, and it really kind of blew my mind to have like 2 weeks, all 5 of us. And I think that really opened us up to both wanting and needing a place and a time. I feel like when you talk about time, you also have to talk about like place or something like this. And it's like to spend time together felt really, really essential.
And of course, one thing, I suppose, which became relevant quite at the beginning, because we met in summer, and you told me that quite at the beginning you started to think about repertoire. And it's interesting because, one of the first artists I ever met, actually, when I was a teenager, I was maybe like 15. I met Eugène Ionesco in St. Gallen, because he came to Switzerland, the city near where I grew up. And he, towards the end of his life, he was quite old. He made lithographs. They are very almost like childlike drawings, very beautiful. And he stopped writing plays. And obviously, I kind of grew up with his plays, the Absurd Theater, the Bold Singer, the Chairs, all these pieces. And so I asked him if we can have a conversation. So we had a coffee. And I think he was the first artist I really had a conversation with. And I will never forget, he told me this story, which I thought was very beautiful. He told me that his piece, La Cantatrice Chauve, the Bold Singer, has been performed for 30 or 40 years every evening as a kind of an almost permanent repertoire. It sort of had its own theater even. In the meanwhile, I think it's still going on. It's probably 50 or 60 years by now. But that was, in the 80s. And already then, it was for many decades. And he was kind of laughing, and he said, my piece, because he was mentioning this French sculptor César, who was very famous at that time and who had put sort of public sculptures everywhere, in bronze and all kinds of materials. And he said, my play is more permanent than his sculptures. They have just removed one of his sculptures in Paris. He was kind of laughing. And like for me, it was like a very unforgettable, sort of early experience to talk about, also in terms of, in terms of repertoire. So I was curious if you can talk a little bit about repertoire, and that will then also bring us to, of course, what you're working on at the moment.
I'm still, grasping repertoire. I think this kind of like the long term, I think like for me, I was just talking about this yesterday with an archivist, like, for me, the best documentation is memory. And so I don't know if I feel resolved about like legacy or this like permanence or something. I think that's really like what you're like, that's really beautiful that a performance can live in this way. It's just not something that I think I understand naturally. It's like something that I'm really challenged by here. And I think like repertoire is a really beautiful way for something to move through time. I feel so like still at the precipice of like moving outside of my own body in performance. Like my practice has been up until now really like through my own corporeal improvisational encounter with an audience. And so I think repertoire is really, really like pushing the thresholds of my thinking around that, which is exciting, but I don't know if I think I have questions around it rather than answers, you know? I think it's like, it also feels like, I remember when you told me this before actually in the summer as well, and thinking like, what, I was like, oh, it's funny that we have this opportunity to move through time in this way. And I never even thought of it. Like I never thought of repertoire as having this possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the challenges for Moved by the Motion to do repertoire at the theater is that since it's improvisational based, it's not like fully scripted or fully rehearsed or fully choreographed. It's like there's sections of it that are like always going to change depending on the day. And so we were kind of thinking, even the starting conversation around us doing repertoire was like, oh, maybe this is a way to like explore repertoire from a different angle, which is sort of to think of it as like a performance that's like continuously evolving. So every time there's a show, it's a different show, which I guess is true, of course, of any live thing. Is like, it's never repeatable, like not like a pre-recorded thing, you know, but even that intention or that embracing of it unfolding in a completely different way seemed for the theater kind of exciting. So we've been kind of playing with that. The other thing that made me think of actually when you were telling your story is just about like, what is the thing that's the work? Because it's kind of like coming from an visual art background. I think we have this thinking around like conceptual art where the work could be like the instructions or like the provocation of something that's in your mind or something. And it actually made me think about starting out doing, like before I like called myself an artist, I just used to throw parties and queer like clubs, and how to do like a weekly party, for example, for me in the beginning was like this commitment to just like showing up and like the DJs play and there's some kind of show and like we don't really care if anyone comes or not. It's just that we're doing it. It's like this commitment to create that possibility that then over time, because it's always there, people like gravitate to it. So it's like in a funny way, I think that continues, and that's sort of like things we all came out of is sort of like maybe we had a practice of that habituation, like informally, you know, just like I feel like you toured with Mickey Blanco one summer opening and like played like a different show every night, but it's, you know what I mean? It's just a thing of repetition, I guess, that has always intrigued me. And working on now Orpheus, that's the piece we're doing for our first repertoire.
Yeah, that of course brings us back to Diaghilev, because the famous interaction or dialogue, you know, between Diaghilev and Cocteau, when Cocteau and Diaghilev exchanged his idea that, you know, the étonnez-moi. Can you talk a little bit about let's talk maybe first about Orpheus and then about Moby Dick, no? I kind of was rereading the other day, you know, about kind of Cocteau talking about Orpheus, not only about the play but also about the film and sort of interest in the supernatural. Can you talk a little bit about how you revisit that?
Yeah. I'm like,
well, first of all, we're really deep in it right now, so I don't even know where to start. But
I feel so submerged in it right now, in the supernatural. Actually,
okay, so I think Orpheus initially came out of this initial project. The one that Tosh and I started our collaboration doing was called A Day in the Life of Bliss, which was this sort of science fiction film that explored a character that was kind of based on her, at the time, her like performer boychild or something. And I had envisioned this whole like parallel world where we could capture her. And like, we're actually still making this film. Like the unrealized project, which I guess is another kind of long form duration, because the image we sent you is from a film shoot that we still haven't, like we just, every couple of years we keep shooting more scenes to this movie. So I have no idea when it's done or how long.
I can have it here. I can put it in the camera. So yeah. 1 second. So yeah, because we did this magazine, and you sent this very exciting page which we published. It's called The Story of Bliss. It's from 2018, and it's your unrealized project.
That was something we shot that we still haven't finished the movie yet. So I kind of love like that. I mean, one of the like operative themes in the original concept was that Bliss was this like kind of pop star who came out of underground, but also got really famous and was like the object of like a lot of desire on social media. This was a very like 2014 moment or something. It was like, what is Instagram? You know, it was kind of like trying to make sense of it at the time. And like, of course it's evolved so much from that, but like, I think it was even Sophia, our collaborator and friend, Sophia Almeria, who suggested we look at Orpheus because of this thing about the gaze and like the death of like the deathly looking or something, and the look back or something. And this in relation to Bliss. So we were kind of researching it again with this like never ending film in mind. And then I guess in confluence with that and the theater, in what ended up happening was we reached out to another friend and collaborator, Candace Williams, who is an artist based in LA. And she's done a lot of research around Eurydice and Orpheus, both actually like Greek mythology in general. I feel like she's sort of like boundless understanding and thought and knowledge about this stuff. And so she's actually here in Zurich. We invited her to come for a couple months, and she's been developing the piece with us. So it's like these collaborations influence, and then also there are these kind of through lines about thematic things. Because I think the gaze has been like a big one for us for a while with the camera lens and stuff like that.
Yeah, Orpheus, it felt like actually a natural progression. We have this kind of exquisite corpse way of working. And it's not to just like totally pivot and turn away from the last project and like jump to something else. I feel like it's like we're constantly thinking about looking and seeing the project of representation. It's like Wu works through film, and I have like a photographic background. So that I think like looking and seeing now as the gaze in Orpheus just felt like the next place to go. I also think like things about the underworld, we're always thinking about subterranean forms or thinking like the underground, the club.
And also like in the Greek mythology, like the underworld was not like a evil place. It was actually just the place people went after life. So it didn't have this moralistic Christian kind of characterization. So for us, it's like we're just re-embracing that idea of hell as being like the club, basically.
Yeah, I'm trying.
With text, because it's obviously, you know, the limiting, the many, you know, issues, of course, with this UNESCO thing, because one thing is that the text never changed, you know, it's sort of static. And you talk a lot about, you know, improvisation, about transformation. And so how do you work with this paradox of having a text, but at the same time, not having a text? I mean, in terms of instruction art, there has been this thing of the open score, no? I mean, Fluxus and Cage, you know, they all question this idea of a score to follow and develop more open scores. And that's very different, you know, from an instruction where the artist supervises how the instruction or the script, as a matter of fact, is being executed. So that it's something which has been around, I think, as a sort of a discussion for a long time. But I was curious how you address that, this paradox, you know, in a way. Script, no script.
Do you mean in general, or just working with Orpheus as like?
Just with this piece, it would be great to hear from this process right now, because you're in the middle of it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think Orpheus it was initially very challenging. This thing of like a text that seems very old, and also like once there's a point where it's formulated and then kind of fixed in time. But actually, I mean, it's interesting too that you bring up Cocteau, because it's such an old myth, the way that it proliferates in culture and other aspects of history, and like even more contemporary ways of pop culture, or like pop culture masculinities, pop stardom, formulations of, like, I would say, women as muse. Like Cocteau's thing is very much about the muse. I think Candace's project, bringing in like the Eurydice and connections with like formlessness and also Black women, I think like there actually, it touches so many things. And another key text, or something that was very helpful to think about Orpheus, was Samuel Delaney's Einstein intersection. And he just like very masterfully talks about myth through many different characters. And I think that especially for me, it really helped free me of this like self-imposed burden of like this really old, stagnant kind of myth that's like I felt like I couldn't access, because he opens it up through like fictionalized characters that are kind of like Jesus or the Beatles or rock and roll. And so I think like that's already 50 years ago when he wrote this. So I think it's like contemporary enough that I can like, think about, we're thinking like we have a character that's actually not in the classical myth. He's of course exemplified through death. His name's Kid Death, and is kind of this like Kurt Cobain character, and thinking about like tragic white masculinities in pop culture. There's a lot of figures also like Lil Peep, or like there's a lot of like these kind of like sad boy rock stars that are like total extensions of Orpheus.
Totally.
So I think we're actually pulling from many places, which is what we typically do. And it's the research, and Candace has been so helpful in like bringing Greek mythology into like how we're affected by it and how it's shaped the world that we live in. It's like we actually pull from many places and realize that it's actually all around us.
Yeah, because the cool thing about Orpheus is there is actually no original author of it. There's not like an original text of Orpheus. It's older than written language. So there are versions that we can trace back that are like the super early ones, like the Ovid, which we actually love, or the Virgil, but like it even is 500 years older than that. So there's no author, which I thought was kind of nice. And I think also this thing Candace taught us about myth and like thinking about certain kinds of myth, I think she calls them like, there are ones that are like more phenomenological, where it's like humans like long time ago trying to explain things like, why does the sun rise and set? And like, why does it get cold and snow? Like there's myths that kind of explain like the earth's processes. But then shortly after that, there are myths that are more about governance and sort of controlling people, which for me is kind of deep, because it's like the myths that basically teach people how to act and how to treat each other. And that sort of rise with like the earliest empires, because essentially once living and became about ruling and like subordinates and rulers, it was like, how do you control an empire where there's no modern technology, Wi-Fi, like a modern army? So it's just like you have to control people through some sort of ethos that's like everyone believes in the same thing. So like I think that's super interesting too, to think about the power of myth as being also about dominating people's ideas. I mean, we have so many of those now that are just kind of manifest maybe even more as like stereotypes. Like I think racial stereotypes are a big one that we're dealing with in this Orpheus, for example.
It's also this is also the most like gendered thing we've done.
Yeah, race and gender for sure. Yeah.
Which is, hopefully you'll see, but
I look very much forward to seeing it. And it's exciting that there is no author, there are all these versions. So it's all about many different perspectives. Now, obviously, with your other project with Moby Dick, there is actually an author. And Herman Melville wrote this book in 1851. So there is an author, but actually, as Charles Olson showed us, who was actually involved with the Black Mountain College, Olson showed us that there is a theory of two Moby Dicks, which I always thought is very fascinating. So there is an author, but there are different versions as well, right? Because there is a Moby Dick version somehow Melville reading King Lear. That's at least Olson's theory. It's never been proven, but Olson's theory is that there is a version Melville reading King Lear, and then another one after having read it. And actually, the first book did not include Ahab, as we discussed the other day. So I'm very curious how you're gonna approach, again, with multiple perspectives, Moby Dick, and also, of course, for the Orpheus project, Candice Williams is so central. And I think for the Moby Dick project, it's Sophia Almaria, if I understand well.
Yeah, we're collaborating with Sophia on the script. I think there's a lot of people that are really deeply involved in this. I think like the theorizing of how to make it. For example, like the whole project started with Laura Harris, who is actually Fred Moten's partner, and she's a scholar and writer. And she has this amazing reading of Moby Dick through C.R.L. James's reading of Moby Dick, because C.R.L. James wrote a book called Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. And Laura, I actually, like, my idea to do Moby Dick really came from her and this like talk that she gave where she was kind of reading the two things together. And it just got like, it's such an expansive, I mean, also another project where you're like, where do I begin with Moby Dick? It's such an expansive novel. Like I feel like it's almost like a biblical type text because there's so much allegory and there's so many layers that you can read it, and it's so long, and like most people haven't read it, so it also has this kind of mythological status where people like know of it, but they have a shape of it in their mind that's kind of abstract. So I think like with every project that we do, this might be a consistency of the move by the motion process, is like there's just an intense concentration and study into the research. And I think we like to take on things that have all these resonances in pop culture. Like I'm almost as fascinated with the way Moby Dick has circulated I'm equally as fascinated with that as I am with the book itself. It's just sort of like all the ways that people kind of grasp and like hold on to this book and see what they want to see in it. It's like, it's a container similar to a myth, it's like a container for you to tell so many different kinds of stories. Do you have other things about Moby Dick?
It's like reading the book is really what I imagine being at sea is like. It's just never ending. I find it I mean, I think as I get older, I am continually shocked, and then I'm like, why am I shocked around things that have to do with the United States? Like it's like in a great American novel, and it's just so strange. I think my initial read of it was just like, there is a profound mundanity to it that's so beyond. And I think actually Ahab as a character feels like really important to our read of it. And I think that's through Laura Harris's read of C.L.R. James's read, is that he kind of represents this like, I mean, he's like a capitalist.
He's a dictator.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think Laura's read is sort of about the sailors, the life of the sailors, and what she calls the motley crew, which is sort of actually a terminology that comes from sailor terminology, but it's the idea of like the workers on the ship who are sort of like clearly the object of Melville's fascination and fetishization, because it's kind of the idea of like this very racially mixed group of men who come from all places and different shades of brown and like black and like Asian and like yellow, he calls them, it's essentially a very racist book, but it's also like very lovingly portrayed. So it's clearly more complex than that. He others them in a very complex way, which I think is also like a subject that Tosh and I like do love and continue to explore. Is just sort of like this complicated relationship to othering that's usually basically like this with desire, Mm-hmm. So like, it's very queer. I think the novel is like, it's like a sort of homosocial queerness to it. And it's very fleshy. It's like literally about this like obsession with this large, like unconceivably large animal that they continuously hunt and they cut up and they dig and they like lose their bodies inside of it and they fall into its head. And like, there's all these like just very visceral kind of, it's like a human fascination with otherness, basically, I think is what the book for me is. And it's just like so infinite, all the ways.
I feel like there's another thing that I'm remembering or reminded of is like, there's another book called Many-Headed Hydra, mm-hmm. which it basically excavates historical accounts of over centuries of the space on sea as being a place of revolt, of like anarchy, of collective working against the oligarchies and monarchies of in particularly England, and that being like a collaborative space that's like the history is totally erased, but there's like many people coming together and fighting against the state or against the monarchy, basically. And yeah, I think like Moby Dick is highly problematic in a way that's like, I think even the things being problematic can almost is kind of flatlined for me in a way, but I think that that comes with this like problem of language in many ways, but there's also like these things in between that can be parsed out to kind of expand our thinking around connections and relationships to people. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else, but it's like, it feels really like a big one.
But thank you so much. I definitely will come and see both of these pieces. When do they start?
Orpheus will be in September now, and Moby Dick will be next year. It's a film with a live orchestra. It's a silent film with a live orchestra.
Yeah. And that's actually interesting because I forgot to ask you about that. It's a question of the film, because you work a lot with film. And now that you work with the Schauspielhaus, what's the relationship to film in terms of these live performances you do at the Schauspielhaus? Will they be accessible or also available via film later or live streamed, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it was kind of part of the conversation to begin. And so we sort of are doing like one production and one film every year. So last year we made a film with this performance that we were doing with Fred's poem, Come On Get It. So that's a film now that exists as an installation. And then this year we're working on Moby Dick, and that will be a film with a live orchestra, which I think we were all excited about, like with the theater too, because it's sort of bringing together the experience of like going to the movies, but also having it be a live event. So for us, like, that's kind of one thing we're trying is like, can we make movies feel also like performances or feel like events or something? And we're shooting all of these movies inside the theater, which is also quite fun because we're kind of using the apparatus that they have, which is like massive spaces and workshops and people that know how to do really specialized things, and kind of like making like a movie studio. Yeah.